This videocast will walk and talk you through an approach to the question that you're looking at here, an A-level question. It was primarily the constitution of the Second Reich, 1871, that made governing the new Germany extremely difficult in the years 1871 to 79. How far do you agree with this statement? Okay, so unpicking that particular question, obviously you need to analyse the question for starters. The topic is about the constitution of the Second Reich. Okay, that's the clear focus of the question. You're given the issue that it was difficult to govern Germany. Governing the new Germany was extremely difficult in the years 1871 to 79. And you're presented with a proposition that the main cause of the difficulties was the constitution that was created in 1871 by Bismarck on the occasion of the unification of Germany at the end of the Franco-Prussian War. And you're asked, how far do you agree with this statement? One useful tip for this type of question, this applies to a lot of questions, is when you're given you're given a topic, the difficulties governing Germany, and you're asked, you're presented with this suggestion that here is a cause, the constitution caused the difficulties. You can almost create a three-way plan, which you will see here. And the way it works is you take the proposition that the constitution caused the difficulties. That's the first third of your answer. You then stick with the proposition, the constitution, but you turn it around, you flip it around, and you say, actually, the constitution did not cause difficulties. It actually was a strength. And that becomes the middle third of your answer. And you then, in the final third of your answer, you look at the difficulties and you say, there were other causes of the difficulties, not just the constitution. So that way the constitution becomes a running thread throughout the three building blocks of your answer. So just re-emphasize that again, so that you'll see this in the three building blocks here. So the constitution is the running thread. In the first building block, you say, yes, the constitution did cause the difficulties. The second, you say the constitution did not cause difficulties. And the third, you say there were other causes of the difficulties. Okay, so let's unpick that and look at how this will actually play out. First of all, your introduction. Okay, so remember, an introduction is a very personal thing. There's no fast or hard rule about how to write an introduction, other than the fact you must demonstrate contextual knowledge. You've got to kind of show an understanding of where the question came from and show historical knowledge. So this is the way I would approach it. I'm just zooming in a little bit here. Okay, so first of all, I would explain that the Constitution of 1871 reflected the two forces that helped create Germany. Okay, so you've clearly got to show the examiner you know that Germany was unified in 1871 and the Constitution came out of it. But the Constitution sort of mirrored the two forces that helped create Germany. What were those two forces? The first force was Prussian militarism. That was the immediate reason for Germany's creation. It was Prussia's defeat of France in the War of 1870-1. But secondly, a long-term force that resulted in Germany's creation was the rise of the European middle classes, or in particular the German middle classes, who believed in liberalism. Now, liberalism is taking power from the upper classes and giving more power to the middle and lower classes. Obviously, this is the age of industrialization. So Europe was in transition. Power was traditionally held by monarchs, but with industrialization, you've got the growth in particular of the middle classes, who are pushing for greater say in the running of their countries. Now, With Germany, there were 38 of them, lots of small countries, were very sort of entrenched, illiberal monarchs who did not really want to share power with the middle classes. And so the German middle classes saw an opportunity in German nationalism, that the creation of a German nation would provide a vehicle to release them from the constraining, from the constraint of what they had before 1871, which was lots of small countries with very unflexible monarchs who were not prepared to share power with the growing middle classes. So therefore German nationalism was supported by the middle class liberals. Okay, so but there you, of course, you have got two forces that sit uncomfortably with each other, because Prussia, that created the German nation, was in itself a very monarchical, conservative country that traditionally did not want to share power with the masses. So you've got Germany created by the Prussian military, and you've also got Germany created by the middle classes. Both of them wanted the creation of a new Germany, but those forces didn't sit comfortably with each other, and that therefore caused tensions. And we know that certainly frustrated the first imperial chancellor Bismarck, whose natural inclination was to resist the middle class liberals. But he knew that he needed them, he needed their support in order to strengthen the country that he had created. So it was a kind of uncomfortable marriage, I suppose. Let's move on. So the first building block, okay, is, and you've got to maintain this focus all the way through then, is the constitution that was created, that Bismarck created. He created it to try to sort of like reconcile, to balance these two forces that had created Germany. But that was a difficult balance that arguably caused difficulties. Okay, so what were these difficulties, and how far were they caused by the Constitution? So point number one, the Constitution made a huge concession to the rising tide, that rising tide of liberalism, in the institution of the Reichstag, which was the lower house of Parliament, elected by all men over the age of 25. And the Reichstag, its approval was needed to get laws passed. But at the same time, the Constitution attempted to retain the traditional powers of the monarchs. So it was a federal constitution. The separate monarchs of the old German states continued to rule. So what the Constitution basically tried to do is it tried to balance the forces of the new, by creating a national parliament elected by all men, one man, one vote, that had the power to pass laws for the whole of Germany, but it was balancing that against the old Germany, where it retained 38 German states, each ruled by their traditional sovereign power, and in most of those cases it was a monarch whose power came from birth, not from the people. So examples, and I've put the examples in italics. It's very important at every point to demonstrate precise knowledge. So accountability, the accountability was upward. The Chancellor was appointed by the Emperor, and the Chancellor was therefore accountable only to the Emperor, not to the people. The Chancellor did not have to give account to the people who were represented in the Reichstag. But the Chancellor needed the support of the Reichstag to govern Germany. He needed a majority. That was a tension. It certainly frustrated Bismarck, who often threatened to close the Reichstag down if he perceived it to be uncooperative. The powers of the Reichstag were contradictory because it had the right to approve or reject legislation, but it could not initiate legislation. The right to initiate lay with the Chancellor, who was appointed by the Emperor. So the initiation of legislation, the formation of policy, was very much from the top down, but that was a tension. So the powers of the Reichstag were contradictory in that sense. So as a result, there was some disappointment at the outcome of 1871. Before 1871, German nationalism was seen to be a very progressive force, largely driven by the middle classes of Germany, who were hoping that the new Germany would reflect their aspirations, mass democracy, power of the middle classes. But after 1871, German nationalism became much more conservative. And you can see that as an example. The source question that we did, if you remember, Bebel, the socialist leader, criticised the Bismarck's press organisation, the Norddeutsche Allgemeine Zeitung newspaper, for waging a Prussian propaganda campaign to repress the powers of the people. He argued it was the new Germany had just become a vehicle to strengthen Prussia monarchical rule. Powers, point number 4, power was divided between the imperial government and the states. Okay, it was a federal system. But each of those had their own agenda. The imperial government wanted to strengthen the central control of Berlin, Bismarck's government, but the separate state governments wanted to preserve regional self-rule, autonomy, against what they saw to be the expansion of Russian power. And that undoubtedly caused tensions. So again, what you've got to do is you've got to give examples, every opportunity, back these points up with precise knowledge. Now, the best example of that is the railway question. If you go to William Carr, page 122, it is explained there. But the state of Bavaria was very resistant to centralisation of railways. It took Prussia 30 years to basically purchase 2/3 of German railway stock. Bismarck had to chip away, making separate agreements with one railway company after another, because the Bavarian state government resisted centralisation. Point number 6, Prussian power and traditions were inevitably diluted. That frustrated Bismarck. It was a difficulty. He very much saw, in 1871, when Germany was created, he saw it as a means of strengthening Prussian control, but inevitably concessions had to be made by admitting non-Prussians and lower-class Germans into the decision-making. He had to make concessions. And so gradually, over the time, we can see that Prussia was losing some of its traditional power. So examples of that: army grants had to be approved by the Reichstag every 7 years, and in peacetime, 3 out of Germany's 4 armies reverted back to the control of their state leaders. So Prussian power is diluted. The individual states held power to legislate in key areas such as education, policing, and also direct taxation. And that latter one, imperial government, was financed, therefore, through indirect taxation revenue. Direct taxation, which the separate states controlled, would be income tax, which is the traditional source of revenue for a central government, but not in the new Germany. In this new Germany, central government, the imperial government, could not access income tax. It was financed through indirect taxation revenue, such as sales tax. Okay, so moving on to building block 2. So here we're sort of turning it around. We're looking at the flip side of the argument. And here you're saying, well, in spite of all those weaknesses, you could present a pretty convincing case that the Constitution did not cause difficulties in governing Germany, and that in many ways the Constitution provided solutions to the difficulties in governing Germany. So let's unpick a few of those points. So number one, for each of the arguments above, there is a convincing counter-argument. We said that. Number two, it could be argued that the balanced constitution that we looked at above enabled flexibility and the maintenance of equilibrium. Equilibrium is balance. Okay, so in the first half of the answer, we've argued that that balance caused tensions. Okay, the two elements were rubbing against each other. Well, here we're saying that the two elements, the rule from above, the power of the monarchs, as opposed to the power of the federal states and the Reichstag, that actually that was a well-balanced solution that worked. So how does that play out? How can you give examples of that? Well, the National Liberals, okay, well, they represented the German middle classes, many of whom were non-Prussian. But they supported the new constitution because they saw the new Germany as giving the middle classes opportunities they'd not had prior to 1871. Hence, the National Liberals worked with Bismarck in the Reichstag. They were not a force of opposition. They cooperated and they supported Bismarck in the Reichstag to pass a lot of very progressive legislation that introduced a common standard in many areas of German life, sort of common legal code, weights and measures, etc., etc. So that worked. Okay, it was not a source of friction. That balance did work because they shared a common interest. Next point, Prussia was able to use its veto in the Bundesrat to control the upper house of parliament. So the Bundesrat, which was a recognition of the federal nature of Germany, allowed the different regional states a say in central affairs. Well, because the different states were allowed to pass their own laws, the constitution respected the regional differences of character, traditions, such as ethnicity and religion. They were allowed to pass laws on their own local affairs. It basically meant that although in theory the Bundesrat could be a central organisation where the state governments could block central legislation, that rarely happened. And in any case, Prussia had the veto in the Bundesrat, the upper house of parliament. So therefore, the Bundesrat gave voice to the separate states, but in the end, it was never an obstacle to Bismarck. He was always able to control it. Next, in the first part of the answer, we said about the army grant issue that theoretically the Reichstag could be a difficulty to Bismarck because he had to go to the Reichstag to get approval to spend money on the army. And because the Reichstag represented the ordinary people, theoretically the Reichstag would probably Bismarck spend money on welfare systems, looking after the poor, rather than pouring lots of money into the army, theoretically. In reality, it was never really a problem. Okay, why was that? Because the Reichstags were elected every 3 years, but army grants were approved for a 7-year period. So that meant that Bismarck only had to go to the Reichstag to ask for approval to spend money on the Reichstag, to spend money on the army. He only had to go to every alternate Reichstag to ask for that approval. Because once approval had been given, then Bismarck could happily then spend his money on the army for the next 7 years. So Reichstags would be elected, come and go, but Bismarck wouldn't need to approach them. Number 6, constitutional obligations counted little for Bismarck, is an argument. Yes, theoretically, the constitution could cause difficulties, but Bismarck's attitude was pretty disdainful towards constitutions. His natural bent was to be authoritarian in his behaviour, and so his view was if the Reichstag and imperial government could not reach agreement, and that rarely happened anyway, but if agreement could not be reached, in Bismarck's view, the imperial government was always right, and if the opposition was not, if the Reichstag was not playing ball, he saw that as basically being factionalism, as being a criminal form of activity harmful to the new nation. So you can very much view the Kulturkampf, the Bismarck's campaign against the Catholics, in that view. And also you can very much see his campaign against the socialists in that light. His natural inclination was, well, I'll just ignore the constitution. If these groups don't cooperate with me in the Reichstag, I will find other ways round this. And the way round this, which is point number 9, is that Bismarck, remember that Germany was a federal system, and that Bismarck wore two hats. He was also the minister-president of the state of Prussia, and Prussia was a much more authoritarian setup. There was a Landtag, there was a parliament in Prussia, but the voting system in Prussia ensured that the upper classes, the elites, had a much greater say in parliament, so it was much easier for Bismarck to pass laws through the Prussian parliament than through the Reichstag. And because Prussia counted for 60% of Germany, Bismarck's natural reaction if he encountered problems with the Reichstag was simply to bulldoze the laws through the Prussian parliament. And that's where much of the Kulturkampf, the campaign against the Catholics, and the anti-socialist laws happened through the Prussian parliament. And in any case, the monarchs of the other states, who likewise passed laws in their own states through their own state parliaments on matters such as education and policing, the monarchs of the other states then usually followed Prussia's lead. So in both the Kulturkampf and the anti-socialist laws, Bismarck effectively bypassed the Reichstag and used the state legislatures to pass the laws that he wanted to be passed. In reality, the majority of the Reichstag deputies, though, were usually deeply respectful of Prussian authority. So again, the reality is, for most of the time, on most of the occasions, Bismarck did not have problems with the Reichstag. He was able to go to the Reichstag, say, I want you to vote to approve of this law. He didn't expect debate, but the Reichstag deputies didn't want debate. They were usually deeply respectful. Prussia had created their country. They saw the benefits as outweighing the difficulties, the disadvantages, and so usually the Reichstag was very, very cooperative with Bismarck, and that included the left-wing parties, the growing social democracy movement in the Reichstag. Were an older generation, and their natural bent was to respect authority, even though they were left-wing in their ideals. Likewise, point number 11, Bismarck was frustrated by the fact that he had to go to the Reichstag to get laws passed. He valued the Reichstag because, although he was frustrated, he valued the Reichstag. Okay, so Bismarck saw it as a useful device for maintaining order. After all, what was the Reichstag? It was a representative body of all men aged 25 and over across the whole of Germany. So Bismarck was naturally suspicious of allowing the unruly masses, as he called them, ordinary people, to have a say in the running of the country. But it was better to give them a voice in one organisation than for them to take their frustrations out onto the streets and for the masses to turn to revolution as bringing about change. At least if they had an elected representative body, the Reichstag, then that was a way of preventing revolution, give them a voice, maintain the illusion that they've got a say. So they were actually a useful device to prevent discontent going into revolutionary channels, contain it within an organisation, within an institution, so that they feel that they have a voice, even though in fact they don't really have much of a voice. So that's another key point. The final building block then is a sort of counterbalance. So you have pretty much throughout the essay maintained a strong focus on the constitution, but it is saying to you, well, what caused the difficulties in governing Germany? And there were other reasons which were not constitutional. So not all of Germany's difficulties in this period arose from the constitutional tensions. There were other factors. Now, if I were you, I'd break them down into external and internal. The external, first of all. So the economic downturn, so that should say 1873, which made Bismarck's alliance with the National Liberals increasingly untenable as he moved away from free trade towards protectionism. Expedient means it was useful. It wasn't Bismarck's natural position to want to team up with the middle classes. Bismarck was much more at home with his own social class, the upper classes holding power. He didn't feel comfortable with being dependent on the party of the middle classes, the National Liberals, to pass laws. But for a period of time it was useful. But once that you got that economic downturn and Bismarck needed to move away from free trade is what the middle classes wanted, towards protectionism, that became more difficult. That was an external pressure. It was not a constitutional pressure, it was an external pressure. Likewise, the Kulturkampf, which was Bismarck's response to the papal announcements of 1864 and 1870, that challenged secularism, the power of the state, and led, of course, to those problems that Bismarck had with German Catholics, where you could argue that that was an external difficulty, not caused by the constitution. Likewise, you could argue the rise of socialism. Socialism was a byproduct of industrialization, which was a European phenomenon in the 19th century. With industrialization, you've got the growth of the working classes, and with the growth of the working classes, you've got them turning to socialism as a vehicle to get more political power for the working classes. So again, those are difficulties that were not caused by the constitution as such. They would have happened anyway. And some difficulties arose from internal factors. They were not all constitutional difficulties, the internal, not least Bismarck himself, the role of personality. Bismarck's natural personality, he was his own worst enemy. He had a tendency to see enemies where there weren't any, which often led him to overreact to perceived threats. So he saw the Catholics to be a threat. When were they really? And likewise the socialists, a tendency to overreact to these groups. So moving into the conclusion, there were undoubtedly tensions, number one, within the constitution that caused Bismarck some difficulties in governing Germany. So don't reject the proposition. Yes, it's undoubtedly true. On balance, though, Bismarck was skillful in using the constitution to balance the different pressures and to steer legislation through. In other words, the constitution was as much a solution as a cause of the difficulties that Bismarck had to deal with. And in fact, external pressures, especially those resulting from the economic downturn and the rise of socialism, were equal causes of the difficulties. So what I've done in that conclusion is I've pulled together different strands of the main body of the answer and tied them together to present an overall judgment to that particular question. But as I say, there's no right or wrong answer to a conclusion as long as you're following those principles. Every conclusion could be different, but that will be my conclusion to that question. Okay, I hope that was useful to you. And you can download from the VLE, from the Padlet page, you can download the actual document that you've been looking at here in this video cast, in which I have walked and talked you through that particular document. I hope that was useful to you. Thank you.